On one side, if you're a fan of Borderlands games, they made a new one 7 years later. On the other side, it is a time exclusive to the Epic Store? On one side, it is apparently pretty good. On the other side, it has the minimal requirements of a modern AAA game. But there are some things that can help with the performance at a cost. Kinda. It's complicated, you will see what I mean in a moment. This is Alex, the LowSpecGamer. Let's explore what lies under the configuration file of the newly released Borderlands 3. This game runs on the now very common Unreal Engine 4 with its configuration file located in the Documents folder rather than the usual local app data folder. Here's the bad news. Most Unreal Engine 4 games allow some variables to be added to scalability.ini to tweak the game graphics with some dramatic results, as we saw in cases such as Vampire or Dauntless. For Borderlands 3 joins the ranks of games like Fortnite or Gears 5 or PUBG in blocking or ignoring this file, which is a shame. Furthermore, all Unreal Engine 4 games have access to a resolution scaler that allows reducing the resolution of the in-game elements without affecting UI or having to change the external resolution of the game, which is scaled up to look okay. It is not Control's miraculous temporal scaler, but it is pretty useful in low-end systems. This is usually controlled with a slider or a variable in game user settings.ini, but not in Borderlands 3. Here you can only select 100, 75, 50%, and that's it. The variable that usually controls this is completely ignored in the game in favor of this guy, who only takes values of 50, 75, and 100. As to why they will block one of the most basic modern game features is confusing, and my best guess is that unorthodox values screw with some of their visual effects, but I'm not sure. You can still set a custom low external or full program resolution with these two lines, as long as you add that resolution first to your GPU's custom resolution list in the NVIDIA, Intel or AMD panel. Okay, so what is left? After exploring and experimenting with most of the variables on game user settings.ini on the lowest settings usually allowed by the game, there are a couple of examples that have amusing effects. Interesting enough, 4 variables on scalability groups remain on maximum values no matter the settings. SG.anti-aliasing quality seems to do nothing, since anti-aliasing is controlled by anti-aliasing mode index further in the file. And so far I have not noticed any difference in effects no matter the value of SG.effects quality. SG.postprocess quality does control some post-processing, as setting it to 0 makes the colors and illumination way more subdued. This is a tricky one, because on one side disabling this does bring a noticeable improvement in performance, but it can make indoor scenes and nighttime combat so dark that it might be difficult to play, so I only recommend this one as a last resort. The other one is SG.view distance quality. Originally, this had me duped, since on every Unreal Engine 4 game I have tested, changes in the draw distance can be noted when certain objects stop being drawn, but this never happens in Borderlands 3. Instead, when setting SG.view distance quality to 0, what essentially happens is that everything still gets drawn at normal distances, but it forces the game to use reduced LOD models with fewer polygons. Now, when this happens, it is usually very obvious and easy to notice, but there's something about the Borderlands graphical style that hides the low poly count until you look really close, or you look directly at a human character without a mask. You can definitely notice how it only loads the full model when really close to the player, and this effect is notable, but easy to get used to, as enemy models usually wear masks or are moving too fast. And since there's less stuff to render, there's a positive performance impact to this change as well, so this is a useful change if you're willing to pay the price. Now, what sort of performance did I get when all was said and done? My first instinct, as usual these days, was to try the Athlon 200GE and its integrated GPU paired with 8 gigs of dual-channel RAM. Interestingly enough, the game will regularly crash with out-of-memory errors until I manually assign 2 gigs to VRAM in BIOS. In 99% of the cases, this does nothing since the game just takes RAM as VRAM as it needs it, but on this specific game it seems to mitigate the errors on AMD integrated GPUs. This was running on 720p and 75% resolution scale, and it changes to force low detail models and no post-processing effects. As you have likely noticed, average performance is between 35 and 40 FPS, which is fantastic for this little guy, and you do not really notice the low poly models, probably because how dark this is without the post-processing. and it gets worse the closer you get to nighttime in the game. As I said, last resort. For a setup like this one, I actually preferred to leave the post-processing on for better visibility. Now you can notice the low poly models, but it is easier to see on a variety of scenes. Performance was indeed lower, but it rarely ever dropped under 30 even when under fire, so pretty fantastic results. To add a bit more variety, I also give it a go on the Intel UHD 620 on the Dell XPS 13 laptop. The IntelHD quickly bottlenecks the laptop i7, but on the same 720p and internal scaler reduced to 50%, it can almost work. This is weaker than the integrated GPU on the Athlon, so here both tweaks have to be used. And performance initially seems fine except for the stuttering that happens every time something loads in the background, which might point to some VRAM bandwidth issue. But hey, no game crashes with lack of memory errors. In that sense, memory management seems to be working. Reducing the resolution entirely to 960 by 540 does not fix the freezing, but it makes it less frequent and almost at the border of being playable. However, I do have to point out that the scaler on this game is very basic and it does not pull the amazing results of Control in low resolutions, so you are looking at quite a blurry result, with the advantage that Borderlands 3 clear visual design makes it easier to see enemies. Now, are there more performance secrets hidden on the configuration file that I did not notice? Maybe, and if something gets discovered, well, you know what to do. But in the meantime, this turned out to be quite an interesting experiment on how the Unreal Engine 4 has evolved. Thank you for watching this video all the way to the end. Hopefully you found it interesting. See you on the next one.